The following program is produced by Londonderry residents. The views and opinions expressed are not necessarily the views and opinions of the LACTV staff or its volunteers, and should not be considered an endorsement by CTV20 or its staff and volunteers.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to another issue of Concord Conversations. Our goal is to bring to you members from the county, from the state, from the city, and maybe in the future even federal, to discuss issues that are important to the citizens of Londonderry and the whole state. Today we have with us Commissioner Frank Edelblut, who is the Commissioner of the Department of Education. And we're going to let Frank explain exactly what the Department of Education does, and then we'll get into some individual subjects that have to do with the department and legislation that we are currently or have worked on. With that, Commissioner Edelblut, welcome, Frank.
Good morning, Sherm. Good morning, Doug. Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me on. So I may not be able to tell you everything that the Department of Education does because I don't think we have that much time. But I can definitely give you kind of a perspective in terms of the role that we play in education and for our citizens and for our students and our families here in the state of New Hampshire. Because many people don't really understand what we do. And I know that because oftentimes we get incoming calls saying like, can you do this? Can you do that? For example, this morning there was a parent who had a question about, can you adjust my bus stop? And it turns out that we're not able to adjust the bus stop, but we are what's referred to as a local control state, and so many of the decisions relative to our public education system are delegated to those local communities, to the local school boards, to the local school leaders, and honestly, the best place for individuals who have either praise or concerns that they want to raise are generally to start there and share with your local community the issues that you are most interested in. At the state level, there's really two organizations. We've got the Department of Education, and then we've got the State Board of Education. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's important to keep those separate. The State Board of Education plays a role specifically around developing and approving rules for the education system, right? So the rules that the local school district is abiding by are rules that are vetted and adopted by the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education also plays an important role in terms of mediating differences and issues that develop at the local school level that can't get resolved locally, right? And so they can then be appealed to the State Board of Education, and they serve in that adjudicatory fashion, kind of judging the merits of the cases. And so that's kind of what they do. The department, on the other hand, is really very much an administrative organization. We are what I refer to oftentimes as a pass-through organization. In New Hampshire, we spend about $3.5 billion on public education in a year, and those funds come to us from a variety of sources. They come to us, through the state. They come to us from federal sources, and they come from other sources, grant funding sources and stuff like that. And then of that, over $3 billion, there's a significant local component, which is raised through local property taxes, which goes directly into the school districts. And so with these funds, they basically come to the Department of Education, and we administer the distribution of those funds. And so the legislature will enact statutes in terms of how we're supposed to distribute those funds. And you give me the money, we, based on the formula that you give us, we disperse the money out to the districts. And then the back half of that is, then we provide what I refer to often as technical assistance to our schools to try and support them in trying to effectively use and deploy those funds in their local school district to meet the objectives that the state or the federal government may have for those specific funds. So for example, we've got a lot of food and nutrition programs, and we receive funding from the federal government for food and nutrition programs. We pass those funds through to the local districts, and we make sure that they are then administering those food and nutrition funds according to the USDA food and nutrition regulations. And so that may include monitoring. Federally, we also take in, as an example, funding for special education. And again, we receive those funds and then we allocate those back out. We receive funds for Title I, which is supporting economically disadvantaged and underperforming students, and we receive that from the federal government, and we distribute that to schools based on a formula that we get from the federal government, and likewise from state funding. We receive certain funds from the state, and we distribute those out to the school districts to be able to implement the various programs. And that includes a lot of different things. So, I mean, the one that everybody's really familiar with or talks about quite often is state adequacy, right? And so state adequacy is the funding that the state provides towards a student's public education. But it can include other programs as well. The state provides us money for adult education program, for career and technical education programs, and a variety of other types of programming that you all provide funding to the department, and then we help to administer that out into the school districts.
If I'm correct, Frank, isn't our school population dropping? Not drastically, but over the last 10 years, I mean, it's dropped quite a bit, hasn't it?
It has, and so it's a relatively steady drop too, to your point, right? So it's not like it's falling off a cliff. In COVID, we did have a little bit of an acceleration of that. But really, if you look over the last 20 years, we've declined 46,000 students from a high of 207,000 students to 161,000 last year. We will be reporting out any day now the current, it's called BOY, beginning of year enrollment numbers. So the schools are finalizing those numbers right now, and we'll be reporting that out. But generally, if you look at the trend, we have seen a decline of about 1 to 1.5 percentage points per year. And we anticipate that that will continue out into the future. Oftentimes, when you see that decline, obviously, all of the schools need to adjust for that decline in terms of numbers of students. And over time, it adds up. 46,000 fewer students in the system is not an insignificant number of reduction in terms of numbers of students. And so, obviously the schools are kind of managing through there. But this year, my kindergarten class is my graduating class of 2036. So I can tell you, plus or minus a relatively small number without some type of a substantive, change in demographic trends, which doesn't look likely, I can tell you what that graduating class looks like in 2036. And you see the trend continuing. And so it's not the kind of statistic that sneaks up on you. It's one that we have a long lead time. I sit as a member of the Board of Trustees for the University System of New Hampshire, and so I can tell that system in 2036, here's how many high school graduates, give or take a small margin of error, that we expect to be available to you, so plan accordingly, right? And so, we've got a long runway, we've got 12 years that we can be working on this and getting ready for that.
So just to be clear on your previous statement, between the Board of Education and the Department of Education, you in terms of affecting a curriculum or what teachers are teaching or how schools are going to be run within their districts or the guidance passed on to them, that comes from the Board of Education, not from the Department of Education?
It comes from the Board of Education, but even honestly, let me just narrow that down a little bit more, because essentially, again, the board is establishing kind of the framework, the rule system under which those local school districts operate. So in terms of the content, it's the State Board of Education that's adopting academic standards and say okay, these are the standards for what you're going to teach. Now, the way that it works is the legislature defines what the content areas are, and that's enumerated in statute, and you say, every kid's got to get math and English and a list of up to, I think we're up to 12 items in there. The State Board of Education defines what does that look like. When you tell me that a kid needs to know math, they need to learn math, the State Board of Education says, okay, so here's what that looks like in first grade and second grade and third grade, and they define the rule system around that, or the academic standards. And then what happens is the local school district then adopts a curriculum that implements that rule set. So the school board is not really involved in the curriculum. Those are decisions that are made by the local school district. The local school district is then hiring teachers to implement that curriculum, and they're responsible for that hiring and firing and managing performance expectations relative to that. The State Board of Education is not involved in that.
So real change, if as it comes, would come through the Board of Education then?
So it comes through a variety. I mean, everybody has a role, right? So you all have a role as the legislature. I think is the most impactful thing in terms of education. You know, the laws that you pass, and as you pass those, then again, we're implementing those. Sometimes when you pass a law, you just say, here's the law. And so it has to be implemented. So the department may issue technical advisory and support for the school district to implement it. Other times you say, like, we want you to do this, and we want the State Board of Education to adopt rules regarding that. And then the State Board would, add some additional texture and some guidance around that particular law for the implementation by the school. So it kind of comes at it both ways, but everybody has a role in that process. Truthfully, when you all pass laws that are very explicit and very specific about what it is your expectation is, then it makes it easier for both the department as well as the State Board of Education to implement those. It was interesting. I won't enumerate the law unless you guys want to talk about it, but you recently enacted a law, and there were some questions that came up at the school level about the implementation of that. And I wasn't exactly sure what you all wanted. So I literally called up to the legislators who passed this law. I said, here's the law that you passed. What was your expectation with regard to this aspect of it? They told us, and then we created technical advisories for the districts to be able to implement that law the way that the legislature wanted it to be implemented. But really, at the end of the day, the legislature really is the supreme driver in terms of what we're doing. So,
Excellent. Thank you.
Let's talk a little, Frank, about the EFAs that were created. I know it's a hugely controversial issue, and I think a lot of people don't really understand, what this does. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on exactly where we stand with the EFAs and the fact that we're not taking money out of the school system when we pass when somebody gets a subsidy for an EFA. So if you could maybe explain that.
Yeah, let me give you a little bit of context for that. So EFA, for those who are unfamiliar, stands for Education Freedom Accounts. It is an education program that is available to a certain number of individuals in the state of New Hampshire. It's interesting because you described it as a little bit controversial. I would say that it's an overwhelmingly popular program.
Yeah.
We've got a tremendous number of families who are seeking to participate in the EFAs. We get a tremendous amount of positive feedback from those families and students who are participating in the EFAs. So really a popular program. It tends to not be as popular with individuals who are kind of in the business of the traditional school, because in some respects, and I don't know why they see this as a zero-sum game, they see it as somehow as competition. When it really isn't competition, what it is focused on making sure that students have an opportunity to learn. And that's really what I think we all share in common is to see our students learn. It's interesting, I have heard the criticism of education freedom accounts as well, that somehow this is taking money from public education. I mean, think about it, I described the role of the department, and what I can tell you is that every year I send exactly the amount of money that the legislature has told me to send to our public schools to the public schools. I don't get to siphon it off for some other program. I send the exact amount of money that they're required to get. And so they're receiving all of those funds, and nobody is shortchanged in the process. So it's really kind of a mischaracterization of how that particular program works. But the way that it essentially works is, if you want to understand education funding in New Hampshire, let me give you kind of education funding 101, I call it. It costs the state and taxpayers about $20,000 per student per year to educate them. Those funds, if you recall, I described where most of those funds come from, but in rough numbers, a good way to look at it is about $15,000 of that comes from local property taxpayers, and about $5,000 of that comes directly through the state funding. And when an individual family decides that they want to take an education freedom account, Now, these are accounts who are available to low and moderate income households, individual families that earn 350% or lower of the federal poverty level. But if they decide they want to participate in an education freedom account, the way that that works is that the state normally would send that $5,000 to their local school district. But when that student leaves the school district, rather than continuing to send money to the school who no longer has that student, those funds are then provided in a digital wallet, in a secure account that allows the family to spend them on qualified educational expenses. There is a little bit of a nuance. So what happens is when that student actually leaves the district, the legislature, you all decided to provide kind of a ramp down payment for the local school district. So the school district will continue to receive funding for that student for up to 2.5 years. But that's sort of a side issue. But those funds then go to this family, and they're able to spend those on qualified education expenses in order to be able to meet the specific educational needs of their student. And what we find is that, you know, children are different, right? They're humans. It turns out we're all different, right? You know, look at the three of us up here, right? We're all different. And so by allowing the families to kind of craft an educational solution that meets the needs of their kids is why it's so overwhelmingly popular. We have families coming all the time who are saying, like, you know, this other school system was just not a good fit for my child. Mm-hmm. It's not a judgment about the particular school. It's just saying it wasn't a good fit. And so I was able to craft a fit that worked. And oftentimes, this is really, it's a point I think that's worth making. When we talk about education, oftentimes people talk about like, well, this is a good school and this is a bad school. And it's really a terrible way to think about our education system. Because I have really good schools that students are not performing well. They're not succeeding. And I have some bad schools where students are doing well. Mm-hmm. And so really, instead of saying, is this a good school or a bad school, what we have to be asking is this the right school for that child? Right? Because when you find the right educational setting for that child, the children just thrive. And again, we get hundreds of stories over and over again from these families who are participating in this program and other types of choice programs that we have in the state, that you find that the students are thriving and succeeding. So the families are doing better, the children are doing better, the state is doing better. Does that help explain that?
It does, and I'm glad you were able to delineate it so well, Frank, because I think a lot of people really don't understand the benefit of the education freedom accounts and what it means to the education of certain kids that just don't, work well or thrive well in a public school, and they need that different schooling system to make them thrive. And I think it's a wonderful idea that we can offer that to the citizens of New Hampshire and allow the kids to get the best education possible. And I think hopefully that's what we're all looking for, is the kids to get the best education as possible.
I think that's what we're after. I mean, I think universally we can all agree, like there's nobody who can't agree that we want good outcomes for the children, right? And when we say that we want good outcomes for the children, we have to put everything on the table in terms of figuring out how to make sure that happens.
Right. And what you're describing, Frank, is that the parents now have a choice.
Correct.
And parents generally know best for their kids, so they know, and they have several choices now. Can you describe some of the choices that parents have chosen by using the EFAs?
Sure, happy to do that. I mean, again, so we think that choices are good because it helps children and it helps families, and that's really what we want to be about. And quite frankly, what we want to see is we want our traditional public schools to adopt a little bit of that mantra and provide more choices within the system. I mean, an example of that choice might be, like if you're in a school district and you've got multiple elementary schools, well, why not say to the parents, you can enroll in whatever elementary school you want? Or maybe if you're a school and you've got, 6 first grade teachers, you might say like, okay, pick the teacher that you want. And what happens is when you give parents a choice, then they have skin in the game. They want to make sure that's successful. It's not like it's just this random assignment. It's like, oh, I happen to get a professor that doesn't work well with my child, right? So we want everybody vested in the successful outcome of that kid. And quite frankly, that turns down the conflict a little bit, because then sometimes a parent says like, well, this isn't working. Well, we're like, well, you chose it. You want to choose something different? Like, give them another choice then. Find what works for your kid. But in New Hampshire, we do believe in this idea of choice and supporting families and supporting parents. We do believe that parents know what's best for their kids, right? And I just think we can't overemphasize that enough, that parents, have the biggest interest in the success of that child. And so we really want to make sure that we are supporting that. But we've got a lot of programs. We've got charter schools, right? We've got a number of charter schools that have been set up in the state. We've got a number of charter schools that have set up around the state. And again, what we're finding is that these choice options are choices that parents want to make. We had one of our schools that started up a year ago, and they're in their second year now. They started up, they tried to not bite off too much to begin with. They started with an enrollment of 150 students in their first year. This year they came back, they've enrolled 225 students, and they have 200 students on the wait list. I've got another charter school that enrolls over 500 kids, I think it's 550 kids. They've got a 500 student wait list, right? So parents are wanting to choose that. But so we just want to continue to create choices for the demand that is out there so that these students can be successful. But we've got choice in charter schools. We've got choice in learning pods. We've got micro schools around the state. And these are really fun little learning environments. We've got hundreds of kids participating in them. And they're kind of like students find, it's a modern day one-room schoolhouse. And what happens is the students, it's multi-age, the kids find their tribe. And we've had students who've gone into these environments that have had learning disabilities that deal with, behavioral disabilities or social disabilities or anxiety, in that larger education setting, and you put them in that smaller setting, and they don't even have an IEP anymore. The students are doing fine in a different educational setting. And so that's a good thing. We've got our Learn Everywhere program, one of my favorite, which is allowing students to earn high school credit in settings outside of the traditional education environment. We've got programs like the Russian School of Mathematics that teaches 350 kids math in the state. And if these guys are teaching them math, let's get them the high school credit while they're in there getting, learning, trigonometry or calculus or whatever it is that they're working on. And then again, you have the education freedom accounts on top of that. And part of the reason, often people ask me why choice? And there are two really important legs to that stool. Probably if I thought about it, I'd come up with a third leg so the stool stands up better. But, we talked about parental choice. And but the other is really as a means to help our education system move forward. Right? For decades, the education system has been trying to improve. You can go all the way back to in 1964, we had something called the Coleman Report. And that was the federal government was studying education and said, this is 10 years past the famous Brown v. Board of Education. We desegregated the schools, and they said, our black population of students are still not performing well. We got to figure out why is that? We don't understand why. So they studied it. They actually came up with that answer. We haven't done anything with that since 1964. But the next year, in 1965, the president implemented his war on poverty. I think it was Lyndon Johnson at the time, right? Gave us the war on poverty. First time put substantive federal dollars into education with the belief that if we educate individuals, then they're going to be able to get good jobs and we won't have poverty. That was 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago at this point in time, right? Then if we keep coming along, we get to President Reagan in 1982, gave us a nation at risk. And they studied and they evaluated our education system, and they said, the famous quote coming out of there says, if a foreign nation had imposed this education system on our country, we would consider it an act of war. But not to be undone. In 1989, George H.W. Bush gave us the National Education Summit, where he said, we need to reform education so that every student can be proficient in math and English and science. And, it turns out that 10 years later, or a little more than 10 years later, we got George W. Bush, who gave us the No Child Left Behind. And he said by 2014, every student will be proficient in math and English and science. And not to be outdone, because this is a bipartisan thing, in 2015, President Obama gave us the Every Student Succeeds Act, which said every kid is going to be proficient in math and English and science. And so clearly for decades, people have recognized that the system is not meeting the needs of all the students. And so they've been trying to do it. And I think part of the problem is that everybody's trying to do something as opposed to create an environment where our education system can adapt to the circumstances that it's facing. And so through these choice programs, we really are using, kind of a market approach, a free market approach that says we need a system that can adapt and change and isn't entrenched in terms of a rigidity, so that this system will adapt into the future and will serve not only the students well today, but in 10 years and in 20 years and in 50 years from now. And so that's really another kind of leg of this choice model to say, how can we create a system where the system is self-adaptive to the changing environment and it doesn't get locked into place?
Yeah. What you've described with all the programs in the past, where administrations have thrown money at the program, and it appears that just throwing more money doesn't improve education. So what have you seen here in New Hampshire that is actively making good changes in improving education where we're not just throwing money out there?
Yeah, so I mean, what you say is sometimes controversial, but it's not controversial in the research at all. I mean, there are hundreds of studies that will demonstrate that additional money doesn't change that trajectory. What we know is going to change the trajectory is engaging those students in their education through making them or allowing them to have choices in terms of making a choice for an education that they want. Because when a parent is engaged in the education, when a student is engaged in education, all the research will tell you we're going to get better outcomes. And so that is really what we are after here.
Well, we've got 3 minutes left, Frank. Can you, and I know we had gone to our school board a few months back talking about getting the more programs in the schools that have to do with teaching kids the different type of professions out there, electricians and plumbers and everything else.
Trades.
The trades, where we're in serious deficit across the state. I mean, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, everybody in the trades is just, they can't find help.
Right.
And it's hurting. Is there any future hope that we can get more schools involved in teaching this, or is it impractical?
So great question, and just so that individuals know, so we do have 29 career and technical education centers around the state. Generally, those are connected to a high school. And the point of those is to allow these students to get exposure to these trades. And they don't just get exposure, like students who are going through those programs become certified welders. Mm-hmm. And they become, licensed nurse, not LPNs, but LNAs, right? Licensed nurse assistant. And every program has some certification. So we want more kids in these programs. The difficulty really is the kids want to participate in these programs, but I like to say there's adult problems that are keeping kids from accessing it. If you look at the programs, again, we've got these 29 centers that are generally attached to a high school. And so that's what's referred to as a receiving high school. So they've got the center. But then you might be a student who's in a school that doesn't have the center, and you have to transport yourself. You have to be transported to the CTE center. And what you find when you look at the statistics is that, and these are rough numbers, I haven't looked at them in a little bit, but about 67% of the students who attend a high school where you have a CTE center take some type of a trade program, right? Mm-hmm. It could just be a course or it could be a full-blown 2-year program, right? So they're participating. If you look at the students who are coming from the sending districts, about 12% of them participate. Now, I know that those students in those other high schools want to participate just the same way, but the difficulty is, again, we put adult problems in the way. And the two adult problems are calendar and schedule, right? Because if these two systems have different school calendars, well, we're taking a day off for a teacher training here and we're not taking one here, then these kids can't go to that program. Or it could be a schedule problem. This school starts at 7:35 and this school starts at 8:05. And so all of a sudden the calendars are off and they can't do it. Or it could be that this student needs to take an English class that's going to conflict. But if the student took the English class over in the receiving school, it would work into the schedule fine. But we say, no, you can't take English in the receiving school. You have to take it back at your high school. And so we've said, so you can't access CTE programming because you still have to take our English class because you can't take an English class from the other one. So imagine you had a kid in Pelham who needs an English class, right? And he wants to come to Londonderry for CTE. Not that you guys have the CTE, but, and we say, well, no, we can't count the Londonderry CTE. Only the Pelham CTE is going to count for Pelham, or only the Pelham English class is going to count. I'm in Pelham. So those are adult problems. Really, we should be able to figure out how to let kids universally work between different New Hampshire high schools to get credit. We should be able to synchronize, calendars and schedules them for these students so that they're not kind of caught in this limbo. I mean, I've got one district, it takes 40 minutes for them to get to the sending school to the receiving school, right? And so the kid is missing a big chunk of the day because they got to transport there for 40 minutes, then they take one class, which is all we're going to let them take, and then we got to transport them back so they can take the rest of their classes. Is it any wonder why the schedules are tough to figure out?
Yeah, well, we only got a couple minutes left. It's a shame because, having been in the trades in, my whole life, that most kids don't understand that they can make a darn good living.
They absolutely
without having, and going to college is great, but not every child is college is what their fit is.
Correct.
But they can become an electrician or a plumber or a carpenter.
Welders,
and make
right,
welders.
nurses,
and make a darn good living for themselves.
Yes, they can.
And I think that's something we've got to try and instill into the high schools and the kids, that there is other options.
Yeah.
Right. The last comment I would like to make is that it seems like either the news media or the education system seems to put a lot of emphasis on the success of a high school program by the percentage of students that go on to college. But I don't often hear about the percentage as a measure of success that goes on into the trades.
So I know we're out of time, but I will just tell you, if you look at the New Hampshire Every Student Succeeds Act plan, so our federal plan for accountability, in our high school, we count someone who goes on to post-secondary equivalent to somebody who gets one of my CTE certificates, as well as some kid who takes the ASVAB military entrance exam. All of those are equivalent, because to your point, all of those are good options for kids.
Well, once again, we are out of time. This half hour went pretty quickly, and I would certainly like to thank Commissioner Edelblut for coming down, and hopefully when you watch this, you'll get a better understanding of the Department of Education, what it does in our overall school system, and how it's working in the state of New Hampshire. And once again, thank you for coming down, and we'll see you next time on Concord Conversations. Thank you very much.
The preceding program was produced by Londonderry residents. The views and opinions expressed are not necessarily the views and opinions of the LACTV staff or its volunteers, and should not be considered an endorsement by CTV 20 or its staff and volunteers.